On the 43rd day of filming The Godfather, Marlon Brando pulled Al Pacino aside between takes and said something that would poison their relationship for the next 30 years. The exact words have been reported differently by the handful of people who overheard them, but the message was clear and devastating. Brando, Hollywood's greatest living actor, was warning his young co-star never to trust someone, and the identity of that person would shock everyone who learned the truth. What happened in the weeks leading up to that moment involved ego, jealousy, a stolen scene that wasn't supposed to exist, and a betrayal that Brando considered unforgivable. This is the story of how two legends went to war on the most important film set of the 1970s, and why Francis Ford Coppola couldn't do anything to stop it. If you remember when movie sets felt like battlegrounds and actors weren't afraid to destroy each other for the sake of art, make sure you're subscribed. The stories we uncover go deeper than the official studio histories, into the conflicts that created the performances we still talk about 50 years later. When production on The Godfather began in March of 1971, the hierarchy on set was absolutely clear. Marlon Brando was the star, the legend, the man who had revolutionized screen acting in the 1950s with performances in A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront. He was being paid a reported $100,000, plus a percentage of the profits to play Don Vito Corleone, and everyone understood that his involvement was the only reason Paramount had greenlit the film. Without Brando, The Godfather would have remained a paperback novel that Hollywood considered unfilmable. Al Pacino was nobody. At 30 years old, he had exactly one film credit, a small part in a picture called Me, Natalie that nobody had seen. He was being paid the Screen Actors Guild minimum of $700 per week to play Michael Corleone, and half the Paramount executives wanted him fired from the moment he arrived on set. He was too short, they said, too intense, too New York, not handsome enough to be a leading man. Francis Ford Coppola had fought to cast him, but even Coppola seemed uncertain in those early weeks, as Pacino struggled to find the character and the studio pressure to replace him mounted daily. While applause rose on set, backstage Brando's real objection wasn't aimed at the camera, but at a name. The initial relationship between Brando and Pacino appeared cordial and professional. Brando had a reputation for being difficult, but he could also be generous to actors he respected. He had mentored James Dean before Dean's death, had helped countless young performers navigate the treacherous waters of Hollywood fame. When Pacino arrived on set, terrified and uncertain, Brando made efforts to put him at ease, sharing stories about his own early struggles, offering technical advice about hitting marks and working with the camera. But beneath that surface cordiality, tensions were already building. Brando had agreed to make The Godfather because he needed the money and the career rehabilitation after years of box office failures. He saw Don Vito as a supporting role, important but limited, a character who would have powerful scenes in the first act and then largely disappear as the story shifted to Michael's transformation. What he didn't anticipate was that Francis Ford Coppola's script and the natural arc of the story would gradually shift focus away from Don Vito toward Michael, making Pacino's character the true protagonist of the film. Cameras went silent, whispers remained. The breaking point came during the filming of the restaurant sequence where Michael Corleone murders Sollozzo and Captain McCluskey. This scene, which occurs roughly halfway through the film, was supposed to be the moment when Michael completes his transformation from civilian to killer, crossing a line that would define the rest of his life. Coppola had planned it meticulously, working with cinematographer Gordon Willis to create a visual style that emphasized Michael's isolation and the weight of what he was about to do. The single sentence Gordon Willis whispered sealed Pacino's fate that day. The scene was scheduled to take 3 days to film, with most of the time devoted to the actual shooting sequence and Michael's escape. What nobody expected was that Pacino would deliver a performance so powerful and nuanced that it would essentially announce him as not just a competent actor, but a generational talent on par with Brando himself. The way Pacino played Michael's nervous tension in the restaurant, the sweat on his face, the fumbling attempt to locate the hidden gun in the bathroom, the moment of hesitation before he pulled the trigger, all of it was executed with a level of authenticity that electrified everyone watching. Pacino had drawn directly on techniques he learned from Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, using sense memory to recreate genuine physical anxiety. Strasberg had taught him that real fear manifests in the body before the mind can control it, in sweating palms and shallow breathing and the hyper-awareness of small details. In the restaurant scene, Pacino wasn't performing nervousness, he was allowing his body to experience it, trusting that the camera would capture truth that no amount of technical acting could fake. 3 days, 3 setups, 1 fate shift. After the restaurant scene, even though nobody said it aloud, the set hierarchy had collapsed. Brando wasn't on set that day, he had no scenes scheduled, and was taking advantage of the downtime to rest at his hotel. But word spread quickly through the production about what Pacino had achieved. Crew members who had been skeptical about his casting were suddenly believers. Paramount executives who had been pushing to fire him abruptly went silent. And Francis Ford Coppola, who had been defending Pacino for weeks while secretly wondering if he had made a catastrophic mistake, finally relaxed. He had his Michael Corleone, and the performance was going to be extraordinary. Dailies burned, doubts extinguished. When Brando returned to set the following week to film scenes with Pacino, the dynamic between them had shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Brando had watched the dailies from the restaurant sequence, and he understood immediately that something significant had happened. The young actor he had condescended to mentor had just announced himself as a serious threat. More than that, Pacino had achieved something in that scene that Brando, for all his genius, rarely managed. He had made the audience completely forget they were watching a performance. The restaurant scene felt absolutely real in a way that Brando's more stylized, theatrical approach to Don Vito never quite achieved. The scene that would become the flashpoint for their conflict was filmed in the 2nd month of production. It's the sequence in the garden where Don Vito, recovering from the assassination attempt, talks to Michael about the family business and his hopes for his son's future. On paper, it's Brando's scene, a moment for Don Vito to express the complicated emotions of a father watching his son become something he never wanted him to be. Coppola had written it as a showcase for Brando, dialogue-heavy material that would give the older actor a chance to demonstrate the vulnerability beneath Don Vito's power. The invisible change Coppola added to the call sheet handed Brando's favorite scene to someone else, but when they actually filmed the scene, something unexpected happened. Pacino's listening, his reactions to Brando's dialogue, became so compelling that the camera naturally gravitated toward him. Gordon Willis, the cinematographer, found himself adjusting his planned shots to capture Pacino's face, the way his eyes reflected Michael's growing understanding of his father's regrets and disappointments. What was supposed to be Brando's emotional climax became a duet, and in that duet, many people on set felt that Pacino was the one truly driving the scene. Pacino's power in this moment came from his mastery of what Strasberg called active listening, the technique of processing another actor's words so deeply that the internal response becomes visible without any overt expression. While Brando performed Don Vito's regrets through dialogue and gesture, Pacino simply absorbed them, allowing his face to become a canvas for Michael's realization that he was inheriting not just power, but his father's accumulated pain and compromise. The scene was Brando's. The frame shifted to Michael. Brando recognized what was happening and didn't like it. During takes, he began to ad-lib, adding lines and business that weren't in the script, attempting to reclaim focus and keep the scene centered on Don Vito rather than Michael's reactions. But Pacino matched him beat for beat, adjusting his performance to accommodate Brando's improvisations while never ceding emotional ground. It became a kind of acting duel, 2 performers fighting for dominance within a single scene, and the tension was palpable to everyone watching. After the 3rd take, Brando requested a break and pulled Coppola aside for a private conversation that lasted nearly 20 minutes. Nobody knows exactly what was said, but people close to the production later reported that Brando was complaining about the way the scene was being filmed, arguing that the focus was shifting too much to Pacino and away from Don Vito. Coppola found himself in an impossible position. He needed Brando happy because losing his star would kill the film, but he also recognized that what Pacino was doing was extraordinary, and trying to suppress it would damage the scene. The compromise they reached was to film additional coverage that emphasized Brando more heavily, shots that could be used in editing to rebalance the scene if needed. But when the footage was eventually cut together, editor William Reynolds and Coppola both agreed that the most powerful version of the scene included substantial focus on Pacino's reactions. The final edit of the garden scene, as it appears in the finished film, is more balanced than what Brando wanted, but still showcases Pacino's ability to hold the screen against one of cinema's greatest actors. The confrontation that everyone on set had been anticipating finally happened on day 43 of production, during a break in filming at the Filmways studio in Harlem. Pacino was in his trailer, reviewing script pages for the upcoming hospital sequence, when Brando knocked on the door and asked to speak with him privately. The conversation that followed was brief, no more than 5 minutes, but it fundamentally altered their relationship and created a rift that would last decades. That night, Pacino wrote in his notebook for the first time, "No turning back now." According to the one crew member who was close enough to overhear portions of the conversation through the thin trailer walls, Brando's tone was serious and almost fatherly. He started by acknowledging Pacino's talent, saying that he was watching the emergence of an important actor, but then he shifted to a warning. He told Pacino never to fully trust Francis Ford Coppola, that the director was ambitious in ways that would ultimately sacrifice actors for his own vision. He suggested that Coppola was manipulating both of them, playing them against each other to generate the kind of tension that would elevate the film. Brando said quietly, "The scene belongs to all of us, but the curtain will close with you." The accusation was devastating, not because it was entirely wrong, but because it contained enough truth to be genuinely troubling. Coppola was an ambitious director who was willing to push his actors to uncomfortable places if it served the story. He had been encouraging the competitive dynamic between Brando and Pacino, recognizing that their mutual wariness was creating an electric tension in their scenes together. Whether that constituted manipulation or simply smart directing was a matter of interpretation, but what made Brando's warning particularly problematic was the way it positioned him as the experienced insider, trying to protect a naive newcomer, which implicitly established a hierarchy that Pacino's performance in the film was actively undermining. Brando was essentially saying that they were both victims of Coppola's ambition, while simultaneously reminding Pacino that he was the junior partner in their relationship. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation disguised as friendly advice. Pacino thought to himself, "I'm not playing to the camera, I'm playing to the silence." Pacino's response was reportedly careful and non-committal. He thanked Brando for the warning and said he would think about what had been said. But privately, he was furious. He understood that Brando was threatened by him, that the older actor's advice was less about protecting Pacino and more about establishing control. The warning wasn't really about Coppola at all. It was about reminding Pacino of his place in the Hollywood hierarchy, about making sure he didn't get too confident or start thinking he could compete with Marlon Brando as an equal. One look, one cut, one transfer of power. Francis Ford Coppola found himself managing an increasingly toxic situation between his two lead actors, while simultaneously fighting for his own survival as director. The Paramount executives were looking for any reason to fire him, and a publicized conflict between Brando and Pacino would have provided exactly the justification they needed. Coppola had to keep both actors happy and productive, while also extracting the performances he needed to make the film work. This decision redefined not just one film, but 70s American acting itself. His solution was to largely keep Brando and Pacino separated whenever possible. Scenes that involved both actors were filmed efficiently and quickly, minimizing the time they had to spend together. When they weren't actively filming, they were kept in different areas of the set, reducing opportunities for interaction that might escalate tensions. Coppola also made a point of praising both actors equally in front of the crew, never showing favoritism that might fuel their rivalry. But Coppola was also acutely aware that the tension between Brando and Pacino was actually benefiting the film. The unease in their scenes together translated to screen as the complicated relationship between Don Vito and Michael, a father and son who loved each other but existed in fundamentally different moral universes. The best scenes between them, including the garden sequence and Don Vito's death scene, have an underlying tension that comes from the actors' real-life dynamic as much as from the script. Years later, Coppola would describe the Brando-Pacino situation as one of the most challenging aspects of making The Godfather. He had two brilliant actors who brought completely different approaches to their work, and managing their egos while extracting great performances required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. The fact that the film succeeded despite their conflict, or perhaps partly because of it, was a testament to Coppola's ability to channel destructive energy into creative productivity. Don Vito's death scene in the garden with his grandson was filmed near the end of principal photography, and it provided one last opportunity for conflict between Brando and Pacino. The scene as written didn't include Michael. It was supposed to be a quiet moment between Don Vito and the child, showing the old man at peace before his sudden heart attack. But during blocking, Coppola made a last-minute decision to add a shot of Michael watching his father from a distance, a visual connection that would resonate with their earlier garden conversation. Brando was reportedly furious about this addition. He saw it as Coppola once again finding ways to insert Pacino into moments that should have belonged solely to Don Vito. The death of the Godfather was supposed to be a powerful standalone moment, not something framed through Michael's perspective. But Coppola held firm, arguing that the shot was essential for narrative continuity and thematic resonance. The insertion of Michael's observing presence changed the meaning of Don Vito's death, from a simple tragic event to a symbolic passing of power and responsibility. The scene was filmed with Brando playing with the child actor, who portrayed his grandson, improvising the business with the orange peel to create a monster face. It's one of the most famous moments in the film, a perfect encapsulation of Don Vito's dual nature as both a loving grandfather and a figure of violence. But the power of that moment was enhanced by the cutaway to Pacino's face, watching his father's last moments of innocent playfulness before death takes him. The editorial choice to cut away from Brando's orange peel mask to Michael's observing expression created a montage effect that constructed meaning neither shot alone could achieve, the innocence of play juxtaposed against the weight of succession. For Brando, that editorial choice represented everything that had frustrated him throughout the production. His showcase moment, his character's final scene, had been recontextualized through Pacino's presence. Michael's observation of his father's death became as important as the death itself, shifting focus away from Don Vito, even in his final moments. It was the ultimate vindication of Coppola's approach and the ultimate confirmation of Brando's fears that he was being upstaged by his younger co-star. When The Godfather was released in March of 1972, it became an immediate cultural phenomenon. The critical response was overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise for both Brando and Pacino's performances. But the nature of that praise revealed exactly what Brando had been fighting against throughout production. Critics described Brando's Don Vito as a brilliant character creation, a memorable supporting performance in a film that belonged to Al Pacino's Michael Corleone. The Academy Award nominations reflected this perception. Brando was nominated for Best Actor, despite having what was functionally a supporting role, a testament to his star power and the iconic nature of his performance. But Pacino was also nominated for Best Supporting Actor, even though he was clearly the protagonist of the film. The studio's decision to campaign him in the supporting category, rather than lead, was partly strategic, avoiding a direct competition with Brando, but it also perpetuated the fiction that The Godfather was Brando's film, when the reality was more complicated. Brando won the Oscar for Best Actor, though he famously refused to accept it, sending Native American activist Sachin Littlefeather to decline the award on his behalf as a protest against Hollywood's treatment of indigenous peoples. The gesture was powerful and controversial, but it also meant that Brando's final moment of triumph for The Godfather became about something other than the performance itself. Pacino lost in the supporting category to Joel Grey for Cabaret, but the loss didn't diminish the fact that his performance had made him a star. The awards season crystallized the fundamental tension that had defined the production. Brando had the legacy and the recognition, but Pacino had the momentum and the future. Critics and audiences were already beginning to recognize that The Godfather's most important performance might not be the one that won the Oscar. Over time, as the film became enshrined as one of cinema's greatest achievements, Pacino's Michael Corleone would be remembered as equally iconic as Brando's Don Vito, if not more so. The shift in perception that Brando had sensed during production became concrete reality. When Francis Ford Coppola began planning The Godfather Part 2, the question of whether to include Brando became immediately complicated by their deteriorating relationship and Brando's demands. The original plan called for flashback sequences showing a young Don Vito in Sicily and New York, which would have been played by a young actor, but also scenes in the 1950s showing an older Don Vito interacting with the adult Michael, which would have required Brando's participation. Brando's asking price for returning was reportedly astronomical, somewhere in the range of $500,000 for just a few days of work. But more than the money, his demands included significant script approval and guarantees about the focus and framing of his scenes. He wanted assurances that his character wouldn't be overshadowed or recontextualized in ways that diminished Don Vito's importance to the story. The implicit message was that he didn't trust Coppola or Pacino to treat his character with appropriate respect. Coppola ultimately decided that meeting Brando's demands wasn't worth the cost and complication. He restructured the script to eliminate the older Don Vito scenes entirely, focusing the flashback sequences on the young Don Vito played by Robert De Niro. The decision was partly financial but also creative. Coppola had become increasingly interested in exploring the parallels and contrasts between father and son by showing them at similar ages, both building their criminal empires but in fundamentally different ways. The elimination of Brando from The Godfather Part 2 meant that Pacino had the sequel entirely to himself. His Michael Corleone was the sole focus, with no legendary co-star to share the spotlight or complicate the narrative. The result was one of the greatest performances in film history, a portrayal of moral degradation and lost humanity that won Pacino widespread acclaim, even though he was again denied the Oscar. In some ways, Brando's absence from the sequel proved exactly what he had feared. The Godfather story could continue and even deepen without Don Vito, because Michael had become the true center of the narrative. The gratitude Brando withheld, the acknowledgement Pacino never gave. 2 missing sentences turned into 30 years of silence, from the completion of The Godfather in 1972 until Brando's death in 2004. The 2 actors maintained a relationship characterized by mutual respect and profound distance. They never worked together again. They rarely spoke in public about each other, and when they did, their comments were carefully measured and diplomatically vague. Brando would acknowledge Pacino's talent while always positioning himself as the elder statesman. Pacino would praise Brando's genius while subtly asserting his own importance to The Godfather's success. Behind the scenes, friends of both actors reported that they harbored lingering resentments. Brando apparently felt that Pacino had never properly acknowledged the older actor's role in making him a star, that Pacino had benefited from Brando's presence and mentorship without showing appropriate gratitude. Pacino reportedly felt that Brando had tried to undermine him throughout production and then taken credit for the film's success without acknowledging that Michael Corleone was its dramatic center. The conflict between them was never dramatic or public enough to become major Hollywood gossip, but people who worked with both actors were aware of the tension. Directors who approached Pacino about projects that had previously been associated with Brando would find him curiously resistant. When Brando's name came up in interviews, Pacino's responses would become careful and guarded. The warmth that characterized his discussions of other collaborators was notably absent when talking about his Godfather co-star. Most tellingly, when Brando published his autobiography in 1994, his discussion of The Godfather included praise for Coppola and various crew members but barely mentioned Pacino. The omission was so glaring that several reviewers noted it, wondering why Brando had so little to say about his co-star's performance. The answer for those who knew the history was obvious. Brando still couldn't acknowledge what everyone else could see, that Pacino had been his equal on The Godfather set, and that the film's enduring power came from their combination rather than Brando's individual genius. In the decades since The Godfather's release, film historians and critics have gradually come to understand that the tension between Brando and Pacino was integral to the film's success, rather than merely an obstacle that Coppola had to overcome. The wariness in their scenes together, the sense that Don Vito and Michael exist in parallel universes despite their love for each other, comes partly from the actors' real-life dynamic. They were performing together while essentially competing for the same space, and that competition created an electric tension that serves the story perfectly. The broader significance of their conflict lies in what it revealed about the changing nature of film acting in the early 1970s. Brando represented the old guard, the charismatic star whose presence guaranteed box office and whose approach to acting emphasized bold choices and theatrical technique. Pacino represented a new generation of method actors who prioritized psychological realism and disappearing into characters rather than dominating them. The clash between these two approaches on the Godfather set was really a clash between two eras of American cinema. What makes their story particularly poignant is that both actors were right about what they feared. Brando was right that the film industry was changing in ways that would make his style of stardom obsolete, that younger actors like Pacino would inherit the roles and acclaim that had once belonged to actors of his generation. And Pacino was right that he couldn't fully emerge as an artist while operating in Brando's shadow, that his own approach to acting required space and recognition that the older actor was reluctant to grant. And Brando's warning to never trust him was it pointed at the wrong person or the right truth. In 2004, when Marlon Brando died at age 80, Al Pacino issued a brief public statement acknowledging the loss of a great actor and noting their work together on The Godfather. The statement was respectful but notably impersonal, lacking the emotional warmth that characterized his tributes to other colleagues who had passed away. The distance was still there, even in death, a permanent estrangement that would never be repaired. What remains unknown is whether Brando ever reconsidered his warning to Pacino about trusting Coppola, whether in his final years he recognized that his jealousy of the younger actor had been misplaced, or whether he went to his grave still convinced that he had been betrayed by both his director and his co-star. Pacino has never publicly discussed the specific warning that Brando gave him on day 43 of production, maintaining a discretion about their private interactions that has only deepened the mystery. The questions that linger are ultimately unanswerable. Would their relationship have been different if Pacino had been less talented, less able to hold his own against Brando's legendary presence? Would Brando have been more generous if the film industry hadn't been changing in ways that threatened his position? Could Coppola have managed their egos differently, or was the conflict inevitable, given the personalities involved and the stakes of the production? What we're left with is the work itself, two extraordinary performances that together created something greater than either actor could have achieved alone. The Godfather endures not despite the conflict between Brando and Pacino, but in some ways because of it. The tension between them translated to screen as the complicated love and distance between a father and son, between old-world values and new-world ruthlessness, between tradition and transformation. Their war on set became the emotional foundation of one of cinema's greatest achievements. So tell us, who do you think Brando's never trust him warning was really about? Coppola, Pacino, or both at once? Leave your interpretation in the comments. I'll pin the best one. And which set showdown do you want to see next in this series? The Crisis Day on Dog Day Afternoon, or the real cops raid during Serpico filming?